Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 164, May 6th to May 12th, 1864. Last week we talked about the Battle of the Wilderness in its entirety. Grant has suffered heavy casualties, but he is not going to be deterred. I think it is really telling that Shiloh saw even less Union casualties in the Wilderness, so this is the biggest amount of loss of life that he has yet seen. It might be easy to think about it from a modern perspective that Grant is essentially just built different, but I think too this combined with what we're talking about this week is going to be a hard pill to swallow. And what I mean by that is that Grant has this reputation of being a butcher, and we're going to see if maybe that's true or whether this is just a necessary strategy. You'll be able to be the judge. While other armies and other army commanders would have retreated back across the Rapidan, Grant would send a message to Lincoln that there was going to be no turning back. There were missed opportunities on both sides, but both would seek a change at the nearby Spotsylvania courthouse. Before we talk about Spotsylvania, though, let's talk a little bit about some Patreon content. And of course, as we get into May here, we will have another movie review. This is going to be Field of Lost Shoes, and that's actually going to be talking about some of the events that we're going to have here coming up in a future episode. So that's going to be the Battle of Newmarket, and that movie portrays the Battle of Newmarket. I'll talk a little bit about the movie, synopsis, historical accuracy, all that stuff, and we will post that to the Patreon. If that sounds like something that would interest you, any of the other movies that we've done here recently, we did The Beguiled a while back, Red Badge of Courage, for instance, with Audie Murphy. If any of that sounds like that would interest you, there's a link to the Patreon. We do memoir reviews as well. We've done Sam R. Watkins and Elisha Hunt Rhodes, two of the more famous memoirs of the Civil War. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, including picture slideshows of the modern battlefields, one that we just did on the Wilderness, once again, the link is in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. In many ways, Spotsylvania is a continuation of the Battle of the Wilderness, so we will return to that battlefield to begin with. May 7th, we'll see the two armies probing one another. Lee especially is interested in what Grant is going to do next. Grant will see retreat is not an option, so his two opportunities to get out of the lines facing the Confederates would be either to pull back to Fredericksburg or advance to nearby Spotsylvania. This would mean advancing along the Brock Road, something we have already mentioned that the Union Army is in possession of. This will characterize the overland campaign in general, Union forces trying to maneuver around the earthworks the Confederates have constructed. In the process, both sides are going to become pretty good at constructing these earthworks, complete with headlogs and traverses. It is a change in tactics that will propel the American Civil War to be included, in some cases, as the first modern war. Just know that in the East, this is what we'll be looking at as we move forward. So on the 7th, Grant would be thinking of pulling his men away from these strong positions where the outnumbered Confederates felt safe. He will send Phil Sheridan on a mission to advance his mounted men on the Brock and Catharpin roads. Now Sheridan is unhappy that the cavalry is being used to guard supply lines as well as scout. Instead, he wants his men to be used as a combat outfit. He's going to try to prove that before the end of the episode. Now he will keep Wilson's division in reserve, those troops having seen heavy action with Rosser. Instead, Torbert's division, commanded by Wesley Merritt and David McMurtry Gregg, would advance with Merritt on the Brock Road and Gregg on the Catharpin Road. Custer's brigade would make contact with Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry near Todd's Tavern. Both sides would engage mostly dismounted, the Confederates having been pushed out of the town. Devon's brigade and Gibbs's reserve brigade would fight against Lee's command, the rebels having constructed breastworks. They would be unable to flank the Gray troopers, but the firing was so intense, the works would actually catch fire, Meanwhile, Gregg would advance to meet Wade Hampton's command. Jeb Stuart had set up his forces to try to block the Federal thrust across the Po River. He will do good service in this final campaign, delaying a push on Spotsylvania. Sheridan, meanwhile, will initially report that he had met with great success. In reality, he had failed in his mission to push down the two avenues the army needed to take. While he had seen some hard fighting, Meade would become increasingly dissatisfied. Meanwhile, Grant would set his army into motion. The 5th and 6th Corps would collide and become entangled, marring the movement. Despite the Union soldiers cheering when they started moving south, the march was recorded as being a bungled operation, and many wrote of its difficulty. Lee would spend much of the day trying to figure out what his opponent was trying to do, hoping a withdrawal perhaps toward Fredericksburg. A staff officer would report artillery on the move, however, signaling the Army of the Potomac maneuvering. Anderson, commanding the 1st Corps now, would lead the way. Crucially, he will face burning forest and the smell of death. Instead of bivouacking where he was supposed to, he would continue marching throughout the night of the 7th. Stuart had successfully screened the movement of the infantry and set the Confederates on the right foot to win a potential race to Spotsylvania. Now, not much is made of Anderson really as a corps commander. They don't really have a whole lot of big wins that you chalk up for him. However, it is considered that this decision to keep moving is probably one of the better things that he does in this role. And we have talked before about, say, Chancellorsville and other battles that occur in mostly wooded terrain. There's all kinds of fires that will occur, especially in the drier areas and the hotter climates, right? And unfortunately, whether it's somebody who is wounded and cannot get off the battlefield or somebody who is already dead, that fire is going to engulf individuals in some of those cases, and it's not going to be a particularly good area for an army to camp, right? So Anderson sees this, he's going to keep moving. May 8th would see the Confederates win the race. Wade Hampton's troopers and horse artillery proved to be irritating to Merritt's cavalry and then Warren's 5th Corps. Warren, it should be said, was on thin ice from his performance at the Wilderness, but he was confident facing only cavalry as he pushed toward the courthouse. Hampton's men would prove to be equal to their delaying action under the watchful eye of Stuart. He would eventually deploy breastworks that would soon be improved into formidable earthworks by the infantry at a place called Laurel Hill. This was near the Spindle Farm, where the Brock Road and Old Courthouse Road branched off. Anderson was told of the dire situation by a civilian and rushed to join the Gray Cavalry. Seemingly in the nick of time, Hannigan's South Carolinians marched up Laurel Hill as John Robinson's division marched out in columns. Laurel Hill proved to be a good defensive position, and the Union troops were not ready to face infantry. In fact, Warren had decided that he would erase the criticism he received just days before and attack with his brigades, which were going to be disorganized and not supporting one another. This, combined with the good placement of Southern muskets, would prove to be a deadly combination. Peter Lyle's brigade had advanced first, chasing the cavalry, and had stopped. Robinson, leading the Maryland Brigade along with Andrew Dennison, would march around. Their line would stop and fire on the rebels, who in turn would unleash a deadly volley on their foe. Robinson would have his knee shattered, and Dennison likewise would be taken away out of the action, hit in the arm. Both men would actually lose those appendages. The Marylanders would be roughly dealt with and withdraw. Lyle's command would likewise try to hit the rebels, but be repulsed in the process. Richard Coulter would take division command, his own brigade suffering heavily, as it too attacked the well-entrenched enemy. Charles Griffin's division would also arrive, forming up to attack. Much like Robinson, Charles Griffin would throw his command in piecemeal. In fact, he denied one brigade the opportunity to discard their knapsacks, a common occurrence before going into combat. Joseph Bartlett's brigade would engage the recently arrived Alabamians under Perry on the left flank of Kershaw's old command. Humphreys and his Mississippi brigade had also deployed on the opposite flank, extending the rebel line. Schweitzer and Roman Ayres, too, would be repulsed. The colonel of the 140th would be killed attacking Laurel Hill, him having survived Saunders Field. This would be a good time to point out that both sides were actually pretty tired from their extended combat and then heavy skirmishing and marching. This is going to be another thing that's actually going to be a characteristic of the overland campaign. It's going to be essentially one continuous marching combat scenario for these soldiers. So there's going to be a lot of individuals who are going to reach the end of their rope in terms of fatigue. And we've only really just begun here as we did the Wilderness. And now we're getting into Spotsylvania, and we're going to continue all the way to Petersburg. Wadsworth's old command will be brought up, commanded by Lysander Cutler. This division had been severely depleted in the Wilderness, but they too would try. Fields' division of the Confederate First Corps had meanwhile arrived and strengthened the position as well, providing additional artillery. Rice and Edward Bragg, commanding Roy Stone's old brigade, would be repulsed. The Iron Brigade, too, under William Robinson, would be hit in the flanks by Alabama troops and would be forced to retire. Warren was desperate for help and called upon Sedgwick, coming up behind him. Now, in the meantime, James Wilson ironically had moved into Spotsylvania Courthouse. His cavalry had been sent roughly on the route that Burnside was supposed to take. Now, if you look at a map, it's essentially coming from the north and then down south, right? This is sort of a diagonal route if you're kind of looking at a map roughly, just to kind of simplify things. And then that's where Laurel Hill action, that's where the action is going on. And then Wilson's cavalry essentially just goes around and then comes in to Spotsylvania Courthouse, which is sort of the goal. That's where to get, and they're essentially in the rear of the Confederates at this point. Early in the fighting, one rebel cavalry regiment had blocked their way, and they had threatened to hit the rebels in the rear. 2 brigades from Anderson had been dispatched and thus forced Wilson to retire. Now, Burnside would probably not have made it to the battlefield in time, still being some ways away, but maybe better coordination by Grant between him and Meade might have been an interesting what-if. You talk about Wilson having been there, if Burnside shows up with his 9th Corps and they're able to push back this very small Confederate force that's blocking their way into the main Confederate rear, Lee's army is still strung out. It's not consolidated, so you could defeat the First Corps in detail in that scenario, and then Lee's going to be in trouble with his 2nd and 3rd Corps coming up. Speaking of Meade, it is around this time that he has a drag-out argument with Sheridan, who he blamed for the now failure to reach Spotsylvania first. The two sides would be heated, Sheridan wanting an expanded role. He would boast that he could get at Stuart if he had the chance. When Meade told Grant would report a remark Sheridan said that he generally knows what he's talking about. It's probably not exactly what Meade was wanting Grant to say and not how he wanted him to react, because he's sort of venting that Sheridan, the subordinate, is boasting how he can take down Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart is still, pretty much the boogeyman of the Confederate cavalry here. And Grant, instead of siding with Meade, is saying, oh, well, if he said he's going to do it, then why don't you let him try, essentially. And so Sheridan would take a large portion of the cavalry away from the army on a search and destroy mission. Now, as we're going to see, this might not be the best move. Cavalry is still important, despite what Sheridan might think. He wants them to be a combat force. But the mounted arm is still going to be very important to scouting and potentially finding where the enemy is. So taking a large portion of the cavalry away in this fashion is going to deprive the army of its eyes and ears, really. Sedgwick's 6th Corps would finally arrive in the Laurel Hill sector, but the Union troops would be very tired. Fatigue from constant fighting and then a hard march was going to take its toll on the action. Warren had been instructed by Grant to continue the attack, but already his 5th Corps had suffered some 1,500 casualties, so he would be hesitant to continue the action. Meade, it should be said, ordered Warren to cooperate with Sedgwick, sparking an outburst from the criticized commander of the 5th Corps. He would bark back that he would not cooperate, but rather someone needed to take the lead. I believe this is also an example of the fatigue the general officers were now suffering. Personally, I also think it's because Warren doesn't want to be making these decisions anymore. He's had been making some decisions. He'd been criticized for it. No longer is he the savior of Gettysburg. Everyone gets to have that title. Apparently, if you're in the Union Army and you fought at Gettysburg and you were a general officer, then you could probably have a little bit of a slice of the pie of being the savior for the Army of the Potomac and, winning the Civil War, essentially, and preserving the Union. However, Warren, that star has kind of fluttered out, and now in a responsibility role, he's getting criticized left and right. So I believe he really doesn't want that responsibility anymore, and that's part of the outburst as well. The 6th Corps would finally prepare to jump off in the evening. The New Jersey Brigade leading the attack, while the Pennsylvania Reserves would flank the rebel line. Anderson had stubbornly hung on with his 2 divisions, but the combined Union Corps would outnumber and outflank him. At the right time, however, Ewell would arrive, extending the Confederate right. The Federal attack would thus falter, with Colin Battle's Alabama men counterattacking and actually pushing the Federals back into their works. There is a description of the fighting in this region. Swords clashed, and revolvers that had never left their holsters to be discharged in anger were freely used. Shouts, yells, imprecations, heard above the noise of battle, were incessant. Alone, a mile beyond relief, menaced by death or captivity, the men were in a good mood to fight, and fight hard. Front, rear, and flanks were lost in the whirl. Organization was gone. Each man depended upon himself. Darkness increased the confusion, and the result hung upon personal tenacity. Shouting helped to encourage the combatants, and ours, deeper, louder, more determined, was most assuring. Bartlett's brigade, which included the 20th Maine, 1st Michigan, and 83rd Pennsylvania, would also be heavily engaged with the Alabama troops, eventually repelling them back to their own lines. Sedgwick would also get some blame by Warren and Meade. They would be critical of his lack of decisive action, including his deferring to Warren. Now, to be fair, Warren is the first officer on the field, really, so it's kind of a common practice for Sedgwick to defer to an officer who is already understanding of the tactical situation on the ground, but it's also could be said that Sedgwick was the better general officer, probably should have taken charge, especially once he gets his footing. Laurel Hill will now grow silent. Hancock's corps was also marching toward the battlefield. They would have brief trouble near Todd's Tavern when facing the Confederate 3rd Corps. Now this corps would be under the new control of Jubal Early due to A.P. Hill falling ill. John Gordon, who had launched that flank attack at the Wilderness in the latter stages, and was generally a reliable commander, would be elevated into division role, actually bypassing Harry Hayes, who would be sent to Ewell's division to allow for the movement. During this action, Nelson Miles and his regiments would actually become trapped. Confronted by, at first, an aggressive attack by Wade Hampton, and then Billy Mahone's command. Thomas Smith would be sent with his Irish Brigade, the 116th Pennsylvania stopping their prayer service to jump into the fray and save Miles. Hancock would then move on from Todd's Tavern to the Spotsylvania battlefield. May 9th would see the armies posturing and digging in. For the Confederates, Ewell's command would form a salient after they had arrived on the right of the Laurel Hill line. This bulge in the rebel defense would follow the high ground near the McCool farm, and while Lee called it a wretched defense, Ewell would point out abandoning the mule shoe, as it would become called, would allow the Federals to get a foothold on this high ground. So artillery would be added, and the rebels dug in, sometimes with their bare hands, lacking proper entrenching tools. John Sedgwick would also try to stabilize his line, focusing particularly with Thomas Neal's command. Neal was losing his cool and tried to pull his men out of the Federal position, so Sedgwick would spend time near the split in the Brock Road. It was here that he would famously say that the enemy sharpshooters could not hit a bull elephant from the range, admonishing the Union troops ducking from the enemy. A Whitworth bolt would hit him just below the eye, killing the Federal Major General. Despite maybe sometimes Sedgwick not being the best battlefield commander, his men loved him, and thus this was a hard blow. Grant could not believe it, even asking if he was actually dead. Horatio Wright would take over the 6th Corps. May 9th would pass with minimal action. Warren would launch some probes of the Confederate line, creating more casualties. We will see the lines take shape, however, going into May 10th. Generally, we will see Hancock's men starting on the right flank and then repositioning into the center of the line across from the Muleshoe. Warren still held the Laurel Hill area, supported by Wright now commanding the 6th Corps. Burnside would then form the left flank of the army. Anderson and the 1st Corps would still occupy the Laurel Hill lines, with Ewell supporting and in the Muleshoe itself. Wilcox's division would be the right, directly across from Burnside. Carter Stevenson of Burnside's command would be hit in the back of the head by a Confederate sharpshooter, his division going to Daniel Leisure, but mostly because the Union Army was running out of officers. Mahone's command of the 3rd Corps would be aligned on the Po River, Barlow's division facing him. Now Meade and Grant considered that the Confederates were shuffling around their troops and would start to shift Hancock. Barlow would remain where he was, the Federals hoping to fool Lee. If the center was weak, as some thought, then the 2nd Corps could exploit this weak point. Early in response would launch Harry Heath on a flanking motion wide to the right of the Federals. His 4 brigades would attack on the 10th, driving back Barlow. In the meantime, Mahone would also look for an opportunity attacking Nelson Miles. Barlow would have to pull his command back across a bend in the Po River. This action was a fierce contest, some Union troops writing about how they made their escape through burning woods, dissuading the attacking Confederates from pursuit. May 10th would also see Grant wishing for a massed assault. In the Overland Campaign, he is constantly wanting a large-scale attack. Remember, too, that at Vicksburg there was a plan to coordinate such an assault, but it did have a lot of problems, and there was actually really a divided front. Warren was given the okay for Meade to begin his attacks earlier, hoping again to probe and find a soft spot in the rebel line. Lack of intelligence gathering with the Federal cavalry gone would punctuate the Union failings in this area. Indeed, Grant letting Sheridan ride off was one mistake amongst a handful the Union high command had displayed so far in the battle. Just to be clear, it's not even the fact that Sheridan leaves, it's the fact that he takes most of the cavalry with him, because he wants a large enough force to crush Jeb Stuart. Well, when you take essentially all the cavalry with you, there's not really a whole lot to go around for an army of, say, 100,000, 120,000 men, right? Warren's command was supposed to combine with Gibbon of the 2nd Corps along with Birney to support the assault that was being made by Emory Upton. We will cover Upton's attack shortly, but first the supporting attacks. Warren's command would be bloodily repulsed yet again. Confederate artillery was able to load double canister, and many regiments had gathered all available firearms, loading several so they could increase their fire rate. The Iron Brigade would be violently thrown back. James Rice would be mortally wounded during his attacks in this sector as well. Hobart Ward's fresh brigade from Birney's division would actually see some success attacking Gregg's depleted Texas Brigade. The 3rd Maine and 86th New York would actually gain the Confederate works, breaking the line before artillery and part of Tige Anderson's brigade would throw them all back. All of these, as mentioned, were later in the day attacks designed to help Upton. Now, Emory Upton, if you recall, was drawing his experience from Rappahannock Station. In that attack, Union troops advanced without loading their weapons, carrying the work with a bayonet instead, capturing many Louisiana troops. You remember that's probably one of the bigger disasters that happens to Lee post-Gettysburg, right? We had the Bristow Station affair in which those were some ill-advised assaults that caused some casualties, but then you also have a situation where Harry Hayes' brigade essentially ceases to exist because a lot of them get captured in this assault. So Upton is going to want to take that experience and here use it in a critical situation. He would suggest just such an attack on the Muleshoe, asking Division Commander Russell and Wright for permission. They would grant him several regiments for this purpose, 12 to 15, which he would organize into column, ready to push and then exploit the potential break. Upton would remark at how splendid the command would be. Several lines would encompass the attack, with only the 121st New York, 96th Pennsylvania, and 5th Maine with their weapons capped. Gershom Mott's 2nd Corps Division would support the attack once a breakthrough was made. Mott's division would soon be converted into a brigade due to their losses and their performance. Barely over 1,000 men would be thrown to try to maybe freeze the Confederates on the right of the intended target. A salient in the line would be Upton's goal, these works guarded by Dole's Georgians, who were all undersized units themselves. Mott's division would jump off and receive heavy fire from Ewell's corps, forcing them to retire. Now Mott is going to receive criticism for his lack of proper support of Upton's charge, but his men were already spent, so it's no wonder he was unable to make a big impact. Meanwhile, Upton and his command would push on toward the salient, catching the Georgians by surprise. Dole's had been receiving skirmish fire all day, and so they were relatively unconcerned until the Union mass appeared out of the woods, a flaw of the Muleshoe, as the Union troops could get quite close before springing a potential attack. A volley was able to be let off, and the Georgians would fight hand-to-hand for some time. North Carolinians, after the combat, would discover some 56 Georgians dead of bayonet wounds. Union regiments would try then to expand the breach. 2 regiments of Walker's Stonewall Brigade would scatter, and Junius Daniel would receive much pressure. Walker was a former student of Stonewall who had been expulsed by the former commander. He would fight to stabilize the line. In the meantime, help would be on the way. Gordon's division would send the regiments to plug the gap, and Maryland Stewart's men would turn to face the Yankees. Ewell would try to rally his scattering corps, barking that he would soon have reinforcements enough to whip the damned lot of them. Gordon's men would be up to the task, pushing back Upton, whose position would become untenable despite heavy fighting and hand-to-hand in some places. Many prisoners would be lost at the cost, maybe 1,000 Union casualties, some of the frontline regiments losing as many as 50%. George Jules would actually fake being killed to escape being made a prisoner. Some 2,000 Confederates would become casualties, though, and the weakness of the Muleshoe, when faced with a determined and concentrated assault, would become apparent. All in all, the day was pretty much a waste by the Union Army. Warren had failed to sparkle yet again, and Burnside really did not attack at all, most likely the fault of Grant, who should have coordinated his corps better. As it was, Wilcox would be greatly outnumbered by the entire 9th Corps on the Confederate right. May 11th would see both sides figuring out next moves while rain would come down. Grant, of course, is still going to wish to try at the Confederates, but his strategy of trying to wear down the rebels was proving very costly. He would call for more troops, emptying out the defenses of Washington, and hold that thought. As mentioned, Grant had decided to give Upton's strategy a try, and at this point he was completely surpassing Meade and giving orders directly. Emory Upton would write that he believed an assault by a larger number would have worked, and the lieutenant general would agree. Hancock's 2nd Corps minus the detached Mott would make the assault. These were arguably the best combat veterans the Army of the Potomac could provide, and they had done good service so far. So a mass attack of 20,000 of them would not be a problem, comprising the divisions of Birney, Barlow, and Gibbon. In the meantime, wagons could be spotted heading to Belle Plain near Fredericksburg. Robert E. Lee was actually informed by his son, Rooney, still attached to the army. Now, considering previous experience, Lee was not too much at fault to believe this could be maneuvering by Grant, maybe changing base to Fredericksburg. As such, he would wish the army to be ready to move and use Ewell's corps to do that, stating that he would want them to attack the retreating columns. Artillery, which had done good service so far at the Wilderness and now Spotsylvania, would be ready to move. This would make Allegheny Johnson very uneasy, informing his commander Ewell. Ewell would agree that perhaps an attack could occur and would renege on the artillery removal, but his orders would arrive too late. Early in the morning on the 12th, despite the muddy terrain, the attack would jump off. Loring would press again at Laurel Hill, and Burnside was also ordered to attack on the left flank. 3:30 a.m., the attack would start to take shape. Hancock had gathered his division commanders at the Brown House, where a colonel from Mott's command had roughly drawn the dispositions of the enemy, so blind the Union forces were as to what they were actually about to face. They knew the McCool house lay within the Muleshoe, and therefore that is where they would wish to aim their attack. Although Barlow had premonitions of death, he would dissuade a colonel from talking about the folly of their mission by telling him to at least point them in the direction of the enemy. Birney and Barlow would have their divisions first, Gibbon following up Barlow on the left, and Mott there to also fill in where necessary. Crocker, commanding Hayes' old brigade, with Ward, then Brooke, and Miles, would lead the attack on the enemy. Despite what some accounts state, the Confederates were ready, although the men facing the large amount of troops were probably softer targets, in my estimation. There was Jones's Virginia Brigade, commanded by Witcher, who had broken at the Wilderness, and the combined Louisiana outfit that had been under Harry Hayes, although he was wounded, and Stafford had been killed. Led by the United States sharpshooters, the Union troops rumbled toward the enemy, gaining high ground and realizing they needed to move down a swell before hitting the rebels. For a time, the rebels were able to put up a defense, but Witcher's brigade eventually broke under the pressure. Maryland Stewart was hit in the flank and captured, along with much of his brigade. Johnson tried desperately to rally his men, long enough for artillery to get up, the Louisiana Tigers calling out that they were about to have blood for supper. Old Clubby was swinging his club at the Yankee attackers, eventually being surrounded and captured, yelling not to shoot his men. Johnson would be cordial in his capture with Hancock, while Stewart would refuse to shake his hand. This is the famous exchange where Hancock is told by Stewart that under the circumstances he cannot take his hand, and Hancock snaps back that under other circumstances he would not have authored. So that's the famous line from Hancock. In the confusion, too, some Union troops thought they had captured Jeb Stuart, who was not actually with the army. Instead, this was Maryland Stewart, he has to explain to them. Walker's Stonewall Brigade would then evaporate. The Confederate brigade commander would write afterward that he heard the clicks of hammers with wet powder, the rain having dealt them a blow. The Louisiana Tigers would break and try to reform at the Union mass that was now engulfing them. Those who did not run would surrender or face hand-to-hand fighting. We actually have a first-hand account from a Union perspective. The Horseshoe was a boiling, bubbling, and hissing cauldron of death. Lee's army was hurled against us as we lay hugging the slope of the earthwork, loading and firing at will, in 5 successive waves, in his effort to retake this, the key to his position. But our fire was too hot, and the waves of gray were successfully beaten back with terrible losses. Once a few hundred, with a stand of colors and their furious charge, reached the inside of the works, to advance was impossible, to retreat was death. For in the great struggle that raged there were few merely wounded. Clubbed muskets and bayonet thrusts were the mode of fighting for those who had used up their cartridges, and frenzy seemed to possess the yelling, demonic hordes on either side, as soft-voiced, tender-hearted men in camp fought like wild beasts to destroy their fellow men. While the attack had proven successful in wiping out Johnson, there was little done to capitalize, a key moment in the assault. Indeed, Johnson's division and casualties, many of them captured, had taken a 78% hit, and 20 artillery pieces were captured, only 8 having escaped. But Barlow would write that the follow-up should have been more deliberate. Union masses of troops were milling about according to some accounts. Burnside, it should be said, was trying to move Potter's division forward in support. James Lane's North Carolinians would fight well, having to refuse their line to deal with Barlow's command, as well as a whole division to their front. As Johnson's division was reformed into a single brigade under Alfred Terry, and would begin to make a fresh line at the base of the salient, Lee would then push his counterattack, just as he had done to deal with Upton's assault. Junius Daniel, joined by some Louisiana troops, would start to form a line combined with the remnants of artillery. Gordon, meanwhile, was putting together the reserve of the division to deal with the breach, throwing first Johnson's Tar Heels, who were dealt with roughly by the large, albeit unorganized Union troops. Johnson would be wounded, Gordon using the available time to organize his own Old Georgia Brigade and Pegram's Brigade of Virginians, commanded by Colonel Hoffman. Lee again would realize the imperative nature of this counterattack and attempt to lead the thrust. John Gordon would proudly state that these were Georgians and Virginians, and they needed no such encouragement, Lee being safely led away. We see another example of Lee just kind of understanding the dire nature of what is about to happen, right? He saw it at the Wilderness. He sees it here now, right? Johnson's division is essentially gone, and he understands that if there is more of an organized effort by the Union troops, it could really just destroy his army, and the war could be over, right? So it's another what if for both sides, right? What if the artillery had still been kept in place? What if there was a better plan once the line was breached to actually capitalize on it? There's a lot of what ifs with Spotsylvania, just as there had been at the Wilderness. The combined attack from Gordon was smashed into Barlow's unorganized forces. A member of the Irish Brigade writing that the lack of cohesion of the units made it so that even two brigades did great effect. Likewise also pushing back Gibbon, albeit with fierce fighting, sometimes hand to hand. Dealing with Birney and Mott would be Ramseur, wounded in the arm while putting his brigade and that of Daniel into motion. In the meantime, Mahone's division was being hurried from their spot on the flank. Harris's Mississippi Brigade would be used to shore up with Ramseur, pressing on the Federals. Lee again would try to lead them, a Mississippi private crying out, "Don't you trust us?" before Lee letting them go alone. Some of the Magnolia Staters were using hatchets in their heavy hand-to-hand fighting. Abner Perrin's brigade would also come up to deal with Mott's command, who could have capitalized on a gap in the Confederate line at the tip of the Muleshoe, splitting Ramseur and Gordon, who had not connected. Perrin would be mortally wounded, but his men would plug the gap, as would South Carolinians of Samuel McGowan, arriving from Wilcox's division. Perrin would join Junius Daniel, who was also mortally wounded in the fighting. The Palmetto Staters were still smarting at their rebuke from Lee, having collapsed against the same Second Corps only days prior. McGowan would be wounded, but the line would hold, despite the redeployment of Brooke and the entering of the Sixth Corps into the fighting. Upton would initially threaten a court-martial of an officer who would not let his men pass by, but soon take that back, following the rough handling of one of his regiments as they gain a rise before the Confederate works. Hancock still clung onto the outer defenses, and Confederates had filed back into the works of their own. Many accounts state just how savage the nature of the fighting was, some men having to stand on bodies of their comrades to continue the fight. Some would even talk about how bayonets and shots could come between logs and over the works themselves. While the 2nd and the 6th Corps would fight it out around the Muleshoe, Warren and the 5th Corps and Burnside's 9th would see limited action. Warren was skittish about his attacks in his sector, again not wanting to assault the strong position. Indeed, I've seen it in sources that Laurel Hill entrenchments were the strongest in the rebel line. Warren would have to receive a notice from Andrew Humphreys that the fault would not be his for continued loss of life. Grant's patience was wearing thin with Warren, and he would actually consider having Andrew Humphreys move into the role for the ineffectual Corps commander. But Warren would jump off and launch the divisions yet again. Griffin's men were hit with an intense fire almost immediately and would fall back, leaving Cutler's division to attack alone, led by the Iron Brigade. Rufus Dawes would write that most of the casualties in this fight were those killed, and combined with the spent nature of the command, would amount to nothing. Warren had indeed failed, but he would not be alone. Potter's division stalled, Burnside would throw in Wilcox and Leisure into the attack, but Lane's and Mahone's old brigade would flank the attack, moving out from their earthworks and scattering the 9th Corps. Two regiments, the 100th Pennsylvania and the 21st Massachusetts, would reach the main battle line, but alone they were forced to retire. May 12th would come to a close, with both sides sustaining collectively some 17,000 casualties. Just to illustrate the hard fighting in the Muleshoe, I have two first-hand accounts of the aftermath, one Union and one Confederate. Passing over the ground inside the works the next day, I was able to appreciate the full measure of its horrors. I shrink from the attempt to describe the scene. It was a ghastly and horrible example of the organized brutality that we call war. No language can adequately portray the sickening spectacle. Imagine, if you can, a line of entrenchment 400 yards in length, a solid wall of timber and earth forming 8 or 10 pin-like enclosures half filled with dead and dying men. They lay in piles, sometimes 5 men deep. Often the dead were lying upon the mortally wounded, who groaned in their death agony and begged for water and prayed for death. Bodies hung upon the works in every form of mangling. Blood and mangling were everywhere, and the sickening stench of the battlefield was over it all. Now we have a Confederate account. We halted in a pasture and broke ranks. Then came the reaction. All moved by the same impulse. We sat down on the wet ground and wept. Not silently, but vociferously, and long. Officers and men together. Some of the boys had been at outs with one another. They made friends, and deplored the times that they were ever held an unkind thought against one so true and brave. Two fellows, both named Bill, who never could get along together, rushed into each other's arms, begging for forgiveness and swearing undying friendship. We washed our hands and faces in pools of rainwater. We were covered with bloody mud from head to foot. Soon we got rations of corn dodger and fried bacon, but not a man could eat. The Confederate account is actually a member of the Mississippi Brigade, Harris's brigade, that gets thrown into the counterattack. And they are into the fighting pretty thick, especially as the day wears on. And that's one of the things that I do want to mention and point out with the battle for the mule shoe and then this action, is that it's a long day of fighting, right? It's not just a couple minutes. They're pretty close to one another, and there's just continuous fighting in this region for pretty much the entire day, right? And we talked about how you're putting your weapon between logs or over logs and sticking your bayonet through a log to try to get at somebody who's so very close to you in these entrenchments, these outer works, these traverses, right? There's accounts of people just kind of popping up and then they're just immediately killed. People faking surrender so they can pull out from both sides, right? Union and Confederates. So it's pretty brutal accounts of this fighting, right? It's one of the harder, I think, things that I've had to really research is just going through some of these accounts. Yeah, I kind of mentioned this in certain scenarios where, or certain battles where you kind of have to take a break at a certain point, and this was certainly one of them, I think, just so brutal the combat was. But to that point, I think we can talk about how at this stage in the war, it's very different than 1861, of course, but in this stage of the war, if you are in the army, you're pretty much a veteran at this point. You've been there. You know what to expect and what to do, and there's just less and less of remorse for killing the enemy as war progresses. It's kind of these individuals who didn't want to be involved with that killing. They wanted to see the elephant. They wanted to prove that they were brave, but the actual taking of a life is something that's still pretty heavy on individuals in 61, 62. Whereas when we get here to 1864, you can still see these horrible situations and have these emotional reactions as we've seen from these accounts, but you're also probably having less of a stigma to kill the enemy, especially in hand-to-hand scenarios, and that's how we get this close quarter fighting here, right? So that's something that we should also point out. So we have that, right? But I also do want to mention, too, and one of the things that I think you get a better idea of when you actually go to Spotsylvania, and they do have a very nice trail system there. I'll probably do a picture slideshow for Spotsylvania at one point where you get to see the Laurel Hill area, right? You get to see where Sedgwick is killed, and then obviously you get the mule shoe. You get to walk in the footsteps of Upton's charge. You get to realize just how close they were to the Confederate works where they pop out of the woods and they're just right there, right? So if you have a massed assault, it's pretty feasible to understand why it was pretty successful and almost, as successful as you could say this attack on the 12th. But the area is just so condensed, right? They have earthworks on both sides. And if you're assaulting this sort of narrow strip of land that you can operate in, you get the idea that the Union troops didn't have enough space to maneuver. If you go there and see, it's like, oh, well, over there, that would be the other part where the Confederate defenses are. So if you have 20,000 guys that are all pushing into this one narrow space, that becomes a problem, right? So you can have this counterattack. And we mentioned how there was a quote from somebody in the Irish Brigade who said, even these brigades that Gordon is throwing at the Union troops, they're proving very effective because they're just unorganized and so condensed in this space that it does become ineffectual. And if you had a better plan once you broke through to reform maybe, and that's very difficult, especially in the Civil War, so I'm not necessarily trying to Monday morning general this, but if you had more of a plan to what to do once the position is broken, then maybe you could have really, again, ended the war, right? If you're able to push back the majority of the Second Corps, you're able to break the Confederate army in half, that's going to be a huge problem for Lee. Let's take a break and talk about Sheridan, though. He would advance with a column that supposedly stretched for 13 miles. While this was a raid, the object was not hit and run, as we have seen from others. Instead, he would invite his counterpart Stuart to take a crack at him. Stuart, it should be said, left a good amount of cavalry with Lee, knowing their importance, unlike his counterpart. He would come up with a plan, using part of his men to harass the Federal rear, while the rest of his men would race to gain the front of the larger Union cavalry force, slowing them down. Sheridan's column, though, was able to reach Beaver Dam Station, recapturing some prisoners, and destroying track, and capturing key supplies at that depot. May 10th would be a day of continued skirmishing, the Confederate cavalry nipping at the heels of the Union troopers. Sheridan would dispatch men to burn the railroad junction at Ashland, while Stuart pressing his already exhausted men to get into position to stop the Union mounted column. Jeb was hoping for help from Richmond's garrison to stop Sheridan, knowing he was pressing his men very hard. Sheridan would leave some men to protect the crossing over the South Anna River, and meanwhile, Wilson and Merritt's divisions would push on to Yellow Tavern. Taking a different road, the Confederate troopers would hopefully be able to catch up to the enemy at that place, a few miles north of Richmond. May 11th would see Stuart gain Yellow Tavern, named for a yellow tavern that there stood, but by 1864 had fallen into disarray. It was still, however, a spot where the Telegraph Road intersected the Mountain Road. Stuart would send on a member of his staff to confer with actually Braxton Bragg, but before he could get any answers from the Confederate Chief of Staff for Davis, Gibbs' Reserve Brigade and Custer would arrive to pressure Lomax. Custer would write that it was not really him leading his men, but rather his men leading him. Wickham's brigade would soon arrive to pitch into the pressured rebel troopers, for a time dealing a blow to Custer and stemming the tide. Stuart had deployed along the Telegraph Road and now turned to face Sheridan. At this point, he did hear from Bragg, so the hope that Epahunton might come up and hit the Yankee cavalry in the rear was a real possibility. Stuart would be without an additional brigade that was still skirmishing with Gregg's division. The Union troops would heavily outnumber him in the action as it got into the afternoon. Wilson on the left and Merritt on the right. In a pouring rain, the attack would begin. Some Union troopers were dismounted while some remained mounted. Their target would be Confederate guns. Stuart would have to face off against Chapman's and Custer's men, who were trying to capture the artillery as well as turn Wickham's flank. Both sides would clash around the high ground the rebel guns had set up on. Jeb Stuart would be in the action, some of his men telling him that he should retire. A member of the Michigan Brigade would hit the cavalry chief in the chest, a wound that would prove mortal. Stuart would be urging his men on, even as he lay dying. Now, maybe one day we will really get into the best cavalry officer of the war, and who that was. And while Stuart had his faults, he certainly needs to be in the conversation. Much like Stonewall, the dent to the morale of the Confederates at his loss would be strongly felt. Now, a lot is made of Stuart and his actions during the Gettysburg campaign. That's really like the one dark spot that if Stuart had been there with the army and he hadn't been riding around the Army of the Potomac, things would have been different. I'm not entirely convinced that that would be the case, because I think both sides were pretty understanding that they were going to meet each other at Gettysburg. So I don't know if necessarily the campaign or the battle folds out incredibly different. It might have been a little bit different to have him there during the first day and whatnot. But it's clear if you briefly analyze Jeb Stuart that he's not without his faults. He's not always the best on the battlefield, but he does have a pretty good record, and he does come up big in certain situations, right? There was a big morale boost to ride around McClellan in 1862. That kind of starts to turn the tide during the 7 days, or prior to the 7 days. And he does do a pretty good job. Even in this campaign, he does a good job as his role as being the cavalry commander for the Army of Northern Virginia. So we kind of have a mixed review of Stewart, I guess we should say, and you'll be able to make your own opinion. He's one of the more interesting characters, and maybe one day I'll talk a little bit more analysis about individuals during the war. I think that could be a post 2025 kind of episode or kind of thing that we do, so stay tuned for that, of course. At Yellow Tavern in May of 1864, though, Fitzhugh Lee would be able to extricate the shattered cavalry command the Confederates had brought to the field. Sheridan would realize that a shot at Richmond would be unlikely, the defenses being strong and also having to deal with landmines, a situation he saw by forcing Confederate prisoners to look for them. And by look for them, I mean he made them walk out there try to find them. Regiments tasked with protecting the capital would start to converge, meaning the Union cavalry would now have to move around the rebels and connect with Benjamin Butler's army. Now, Butler had stalled in his Bermuda Hundred campaign, which is a subject we will get into in a later episode. But for now, he would provide a soft landing spot for the Federal troopers. So, while we have now done the famous assault on the Mule Shoe as well as the Yellow Tavern portion of the Spotsylvania campaign, we do have some additional fighting to talk about at Spotsylvania, if you believe it or not. Lee would fall back to a new line, leaving the Mule Shoe. He would request additional troops, his command now whittled down to some 40,000 men. Grant, meanwhile, would plot another way to get at the Confederates. Potentially, he would move out of the line and try to move around Lee again, making it a race to the North Anna. But he wanted to try at Spotsylvania again, holding Hancock and Burnside in place, and then wanting to move Warren and Wright into position to attack the supposed weaker right flank. Warren, though, was down to maybe 5,000 effectives in his corps, and he was reinforced with Henry Kitching and the heavy artillery units, converting into infantry. Troops under Wright and Warren would be too wary to attack on the 13th, moving into heavy mud. Morale in the Army of the Potomac was extremely low, so Meade would call off the attack. There would be some action on the 14th involving the 6th Corps as they moved into position to watch the Massaponax Church Road, which ran east, a crucial line for Lee. Upton would skirmish with Chambliss's cavalry, pushing them off a strong hill position. Harris's Mississippi Brigade, combining with the cavalry, would push Emory Upton off the hill, capturing some men in the process. They even almost captured George Meade and Horatio Wright as they rode to view the hill. Union troops would eventually move back into position, overlooking the road and the hill, the Confederates having withdrawn. Gaining the road would have meant also gaining Lee's vulnerable right flank. More probing would be done on both sides, Grant eventually deciding he would disengage and move on a rail line through Bowling Green, and in so doing secure Port Royal, a key town in Virginia that could be supplied via water for his army. This was not before Hancock feigned an attack on the Spotsylvania line, the rebels having shifted Anderson to the right. Artillery would dissuade the attack from truly jumping off, only adding 1,500 more casualties to the list. Joshua Owen would be court-martialed and relieved of his command for ordering the Philadelphia Brigade to retreat in this action. Lee, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what his intentions were with cavalry. Rosser's cavalry would fall on the 2nd Ohio and drive it toward Ferraro's division, who would briefly skirmish with the mounted arm. This would be the first fight between the Army of Northern Virginia and black troops. As the Union Army would start to move out, Ewell would probe more aggressively. Ramseur would run into heavy artillery regiments on May 19th at a place called the Harris Farm. This aggressive move actually took troops up the Brock Road and fell on the heavies under Erasmus Tyler near some baggage. The heavy artillery regiments would cede the Elephant for the first time against veteran rebel troops, having to reform and then being reinforced by 2 veteran regiments returning from guard duty, as well as reinforcements from Crawford, including the Maryland Brigade, who we began this action with at Laurel Hill. They would stabilize the line, the two sides disengaging. Ewell was isolated from the rest of the army, and the attack was pretty ill-advised. With the action at the Harris Farm concluded, we will end the Battle of Spotsylvania. Like so many battles during the war, I think it's worth maybe rewinding and taking a look back, since there's so much going on. Overall, Grant and Meade would launch attacks that could have been better supported with military intelligence. Laurel Hill was strong and really a waste of time, but the Union Army could have gained Spotsylvania before Anderson was there, so there's a missed opportunity. The attacks on the Mule Shoe might have worked had there been proper support and the brigades been able to organize before a counterattack. Additionally, Lee is going to want to take more operational control moving forward, like Grant. The Gray Fox is going to be wary of the constantly sick A.B. Hill and losing faith in Ewell. As it was, if you combine Spotsylvania with the Wilderness as one continuous fight, this action would have netted the most casualties in any battle during the war. Spotsylvania itself cost 18,400 Union troops compared to 12,600 rebels. As Grant was being reinforced, this was deemed a necessary loss. Lee too would be getting additional troops, but as we can see, he is even less likely to wage any kind of offensive action. Next week, we'll check in on one of the other offenses in Virginia, heading out to the valley for the Battle of Newmarket. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.